Polis, we get this disagreement. It's a pretty fundamental disagreement on the issue of whether it is good to do injustice. And Socrates says the worst thing for a human being is to do injustice and to not be caught and punished, because then you have done the worst thing for your soul and you have no ability to correct it. Okay? Socrates goes so far as to say that it is better to be a victim of injustice than to do injustice, because the soul is so very important in his view. Okay? Now, that is not to say that Socrates is advocating victimhood, that you should seek it out. He really is just saying, if you had to choose between two very not attractive options, between doing wrong and being wrong, it's always preferable to be wrong, simply because doing wrong does you more damage. You yourself doing wrong does you more damage. So you can begin to feel where he's coming from. You know, what's inside of us, what's internal to us, is much more important to Socrates than what is external. Now, Polis, on the other hand, you know, remember the way he's talked about the tyrant Archelaus, right? Archelaus was this man who came to power even though he was supposed to be a slave, a very lowly member of the household of the king of Macedonia, but through his scheming and his violence, and actually killed children who stood in the way of his ascendancy. So he became king of Macedonia, and then no one could touch him, so he was free from punishment. Okay, but Polis says he used to be the most admired. Socrates would obviously say he's the least. He should be the least admired because he's done the most harm to himself. Okay? Polis would say to be a victim is the worst evil. Okay? So this is the fundamental disagreement between the two of them. And this really drives people like Polis. They think of the world, and very reasonably so, I think, in terms of a massive competition. Okay? I put this up here because you may be familiar with Thomas Hobbes at some point. If you're not, you will probably learn from me or somebody else about his social contract theory. But Thomas Hobbes was a 17th century political philosopher from England who had this notion of the state of nature. The state of nature was a condition in which people lived without any sort of law and order. Okay? So basically Hobbes said, imagine what people would be like if you took away government and all law and order. Okay? What would they do? Well, there are various opinions about this. Okay? And some people point out historical examples where this has happened, or current examples where this has happened, where you have basically government breakdown, okay, and you get civil wars, or you get so much crime and unruly behavior that people can't hardly survive. Okay? But then other people will point out, well, the reason why people behave that way in those circumstances is because they've been conditioned by society and government to see their fellow man in a particular way, in a selfish way. Okay? When we get to Marx, we'll see that argument. We've been conditioned to see our fellow man in a selfish way. So of course, if you take away government entirely, all of a sudden, people will attack each other, because it will be, eat or be eaten, because we've been conditioned to think of our fellow man in this way. Now, Hobbes definitely thought that if you took the lid off of people, that what would happen would be that they would all be very suspicious of each other, because we can't read each other's minds. So we've got, if we're rational and self-interested, we've got to assume that the other person may actually want to take something from us, or may consider us a threat. And under those circumstances, it's only rational to try to kill the threat, to get rid of the threat, before it really truly becomes a threat. So he thought that people would actually preempt each other's violent actions by attempting to, get rid of the enemy before they became the enemy. You would have this, he said, constant state of war, in which people were either trying to get away from each other or trying to kill each other as threats. And you would have this just, what did he call it? He called it a state in which life is poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Right? So this seems to be Polis's view of human nature, okay? And an awful lot of other people would agree with him, okay? That as a matter of fact, people will take advantage of whatever opportunities they have, and they will take advantage of their fellow man, and really the only thing that's holding them back is the government, the law, okay? But even within the bounds of the law, there's a lot of competition, and you either are going to be on the top or you're going to be on the bottom. You're either going to be a victor or you're going to be vanquished. And so you owe it to yourself at all times to try to get ahead, because if you don't, if you try to be good, okay, morally good that is, and restrain yourself, you will simply become a victim. Now, how can you, in good conscience to yourself, allow yourself to become a victim under those circumstances? Okay? So that's the way Polis thinks, and a lot of realists think that way. So we can generally identify him with realist thought. Okay? So Polis challenges Socrates, and this is a challenge that also appears in the Republic, where Thrasymachus, Glaucon and Adeimantus in the Republic actually express this. Okay? Why should we do what is right even if we get no reward and we actually get punished for it in this life? Okay? Why should we stick to what is just and what is right if actually what comes back to us is persecution, or people take advantage? Does that seem smart? Okay. They would point out, in fact in the Republic they do, Glaucon and Adeimantus point out that sometimes a man who is a righteous man, a just man, actually becomes hated and reviled in his community through no fault of his own, simply because the people who are willing to paint him as the enemy they have no scruples and they're able to do it. Okay, but because he has scruples, he can't fight fire with fire. He actually can be thrown in jail, executed. Why in the world would anybody think that was a smart way to proceed? Well, for what it's worth, Socrates thinks, and this is very hard to deal with, and even in his own time, as you can see, a lot of people did not, okay, is that no matter what happens externally, okay, our internal state truly is so much more important that he would adhere to something like the old saying, integrity is its own reward. Okay? Now, Socrates isn't somebody who's so, duty-oriented that he forgets the reward. Okay? But the reward is self-satisfaction. It is a sort of happiness that he thinks you can only get when you're actually fully in charge of yourself and not being pushed back and forth by the demands of your society or by circumstances. Okay? So when you're actually fully in control of yourself and only doing what you deem right, there is a form of happiness or satisfaction that comes from that, in his view. Okay? So, what Socrates tries to do with Polis, who is a young man, a follower of Gorgias, somebody who is an aspiring rhetorician, somebody who wants to teach rhetoric, okay, like Gorgias, Socrates tries to show Polis his own internal contradictions. Okay, now, you may be irritated by Socrates. A lot of people are, as he goes through this procedure with Polis. It's sort of like getting a proctoscope, up your you-know-what. It's not going to be fun for Polis or the reader. But the purpose seems to be to show Polis that he thinks contradictory things, okay, for whatever reason. And so he gets Polis to agree to this. Okay? And this is not what Polis really thinks, or what he would have just said that he thought. Okay? But Socrates gets him to say it's ugly to do wrong, meaning it's unattractive. or painful, bad. It's ugly to do wrong, and justice is beautiful. Now, why do you think that somebody like Polus, who has just said that Archelaus is to be so admired and imitated even, would come around to saying something like this?
Probably is talking pretty generally, I'm guessing. Like, he's just applying it to the masses. Like, the king would have been an exception to that.
Yeah, he might see the king as an exception, or think about him on an emotional basis, but perhaps when he's answering this question, he's thinking rationally or more generally. Okay, yeah.
It's only wrong if you overreach.
Okay, so it becomes wrong if you go too far.
Or if you get caught.
If you get caught, yes, and he does end up saying that. I mean, he's basically said that too. He holds that opinion as well, that it's bad if you get caught. If you don't get caught, it's good. Mm-hmm.
His responses, pretty much everybody's responses, seem more like conditioning. They give one-word responses. Socrates asks a big-long question. They answer quickly, and most of them are rhetoricians who go upon statements like this, and they say what we want to hear. So when someone says, "Yeah, that's something I say to the public," yeah, okay, yeah, that sounds right.
Good, yeah. It could be that because he is a trained rhetorician, that he says what people want to hear at this point. I mean, how could you say otherwise? Later, Callicles says something like that, but he doesn't blame it entirely on rhetoric. He says that Polus basically was ashamed to say what he thought, that when asked the question in the way that Socrates asks, he felt the pressure of the people around him, maybe societal pressure, to basically say what people wanted to hear. But I think that your argument might actually be better than that. He says what he thinks that people want to hear at the moment. So we just need to keep that in the back of our mind, that Polus has really kind of completely contradicted himself. Okay? Is he schizophrenic, or is it social pressure, or is it his training as a rhetorician? Something has made him reverse himself. Okay? Socrates then pushes him because he's gotten him to say it's ugly to do wrong, right? So then he gives these terms definitions, and he gets Polus to agree to the definitions. So he says ugly is what is bad for us because it's painful, harmful, or distasteful somehow. Beautiful is what's good for us, and he gets Polus to agree to these definitions. Now you can see that means that what? Injustice is bad for us and justice is good for us, which is actually Socrates' opinion. Okay? And so at the very least we can say Polus has a sort of moral conflict, and possibly, I mean that's another option anyway, that he has a moral conflict, which actually many of us have. Yes, maybe he feels pressured, but isn't it possible also that he actually holds the 2 points of view at the same time? Are we all terribly consistent, or doesn't it kind of matter what situation we're in at the time, for instance? Okay. So it's possible that we both admire the just, but we also admire the unjust, for instance. Or that we imagine that success can come from injustice, but also from justice. Okay? So this is the kind of thing that's going on in his head here. Okay? And so he would say, yes, injustice is shameful sometimes, but other times it's actually admirable, maybe both. It's particularly shameful when you get caught, as somebody pointed out. But victimhood is the worst shame, and he remains consistent on that. And I think that is the key to Polus's problem, okay, with Socrates, is that he can't get around this, that to be a victim of other people is the worst thing that could happen to you in his view, and he's not willing to agree with Socrates otherwise, okay? So we have to understand Socrates' view Very different than Polus. Okay? If for Polus being a victim is the worst thing that can happen to you, it's because the physical world, is our world. So if you're a victim, for instance, you can lose your life. If you lose your life, what do you have? Okay? Or you can lose all your property. You can lose your freedom. So if the material world, the external world, is the world and the most important thing, then Polus is right. So Socrates, again, sees things very differently. For him, there is this other world, so to speak, okay? The interior world, the life of the soul, and maybe even the afterlife, okay? So by the end of the dialogue, he discusses one possibility about the afterlife. But Socrates did entertain the idea of life after death, and he did entertain the idea of justice in life after death. In other words, that injustice was punished and justice was rewarded. Okay? So that's why he tends on the side of, the soul, of just punishment being the cure of the soul. The Polus would say, well, the worst thing is to be caught. Socrates actually says, you shouldn't do injustice to begin with, but if you do, you should hope that you're caught, because that gives you the chance to reform, to change, and to regulate your soul accordingly. Okay? That's why for Socrates, just laws are so important. That's why political philosophy is so important, and why it's important to get these politicians to think about justice, because if the government has just laws, then people will be guided by them. When they violate them, they will be punished rightly, right? Which will guide them hopefully back into a reformed way of life. Okay? So that's why politics and the laws that come from the legislative process are so important for Socrates. He ties them directly to people's souls. If you live in a bad regime with bad laws, they encourage you to be a bad person. You're punished for the wrong things. Actually, in a bad regime, you can be punished for being a good person, right? Okay? Thrown in jail for the rest of your life, because you dared to criticize a dictatorship. So, for him, it's crucial that you have a good government with decent leaders and good laws, because this is what determines what the society will encourage. Will it encourage truly good people, or will it encourage bad people and bad behavior? Okay. All right, so he even goes so far as to say to Polus that a just person will use rhetoric to prosecute even his own family members if his own family members have done wrong, or even to turn himself in if he's done wrong, which is the ultimate overturning of the purpose of rhetoric, from Gorgias and Polus' point of view. Rhetoric might be useful in teaching people what your family members have done wrong and bringing them to justice. I have these two pictures up here because I just want to point out that is actually more problematic than it sounds, because these two regimes, the Nazis and the communist Chinese during the Cultural Revolution, both used young people to do exactly that for the wrong purpose. They encouraged their young family members to spy on and to accuse their parents and teachers, their elders, in other words, to create terror in society. And it was like a complete overturning of the natural order of the family. Okay? Those are extreme cases, and they were bad regimes, but it is rather shocking, and it would have been shocking in Socrates' time for sure, to make the suggestion that you should value the law and justice over your blood relations. Okay? That would seem extreme. I say especially in his time, because it was considered the height of goodness, actually, and piety, to be a good son or daughter, father, mother. We were supposed to watch out for each other, even to the point of protecting each other if we got into trouble. Okay? So it would have been considered impious and wrong from the perspective of most of the people of this society to turn in your father, for instance, if he murdered some slave. Okay? So you were supposed to help him. You were supposed to protect him. And Socrates is bringing in what came to be really the Western view of justice, that justice is more important than individual relationships. It took a long time for that to fully percolate. During the Middle Ages, justice was somewhat universal, but it was class-based. So justice was one thing for the aristocracy, another thing for the serfs, and another thing for the church, and so forth. But by the time you move into the modern era, it's egalitarian. Okay? It's one size fits all. That's the idea. And so Socrates starts that by making this, just bringing it home. This just really makes it clear. Doesn't matter if it's your father or your brother. Justice is more important. Okay? You're supposed to see your fellow human beings as all equal under justice. So the guy that you don't even know, if he's a victim of your brother, should be helped and is more important than your brother. Now, even to this day, when it comes down to brass tacks and you're confronted with that, it can be a difficult decision, I think, for a lot of people. But more people entertain this possibility than ever before, that justice is more important than your own personal relationships. Okay? So this seems absolutely ridiculous to Polus, and really wrong. And I just want to point out that's a big cultural problem, a big taboo, you'll say, that he's just kind of whacked at here. And so Polus is actually on the right side from the point of view of most of the people in Socrates' society. And with that, Socrates has ratcheted it up to the point where apparently Plato thinks that we need somebody else, because we've come to a point of opposition with Socrates and Polus. Polus hasn't agreed, but he's been pretty easily fooled. Ultimately he hasn't agreed inside, but he's gone along. And he's gotten to this point where he reacts with just sort of like, what are you saying? That's ridiculous. Okay? That's what Klosko is talking about, that Plato points out that you can say yes, 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 yes to arguments all the way along, but if your heart is not there, you can still reject them all, and it doesn't matter to you. Okay, so that's what's happened to Polus. So Socrates hasn't really been able to change Polus. If Socrates' project is to change him and make him a different person through his arguments, he's failed. Okay? He's the same person. So we get next Callicles. He is really, is a sophist. He's depicted as a sophist, a type of philosopher whose emphasis is on realism, on self-interest, right? And he really, really provides us with some interesting theories of his own. Polus doesn't really have theories, okay? He just has feelings and ideas, but he doesn't articulate a full-fledged theory at all, okay? But with Callicles we get a theory, and that makes it even harder for Socrates, okay? So Callicles, I put this up here because this is what angers Callicles about this whole thing with Polus and Gorgias. He says both Polus and Gorgias screwed up because both in their own way backed down from what they really thought, and they were ashamed by Socrates. Okay, so we already discussed how that happened to Polus. Remember that Gorgias said he could teach justice, so he sort of waffled after basically saying rhetoric is, really great because you can use it to manipulate the society to get what you want. Then he turned around and said, well, a teacher's not really responsible when his students do wrong. And by the way, if I had to, I'd teach them what is right. I really do know that. So he waffled around. He makes this claim on page 19 And that is where Socrates gets him. Okay, so Callicles complains about this. He thinks both of them were not up to the challenge right there. Okay, and he, of course, thinks that he will do better. And he does, actually. Yeah, okay. And the way that he does that is, he says, first of all, this adds a new level of sophistication to the argument. First of all, he says, Socrates is not speaking about what is natural and true. He's just defending popular opinion. If you ask anybody, should you obey the gods? Should you give, to charity? Should you, be kind to your neighbor? They're going to say yes. And this is because most people, it benefits most people most of the time if others are kind. Okay? But it's popular opinion. It's not necessarily true. And he goes on to say morality itself is man-made. It is not necessarily true at all. Okay? When I say convention, I mean man-made. It's a creation of people in order to produce a certain effect. Okay? Now that might be kind of hard. It depends on where you come from, I guess, as to whether that's kind of hard to wrap your head around or not. Okay? But if you've been taught, the Ten Commandments or the secular equivalent thereof, these are the rules by which you live your life. This is what a good person does. Okay? You may think that these are sort of universal truths, moral imperatives, so to speak. Okay? And that they exist apart from people's opinions about whether they're right or wrong, good or bad, useful or not. But what Callicles is saying is that no, they're actually inventions. They don't have an existence apart from human beings. They're not really universally true. Callicles is one of those who believes that all moral rules are actually man-made, and they can change and differ from people to people, from place to place, and time to time. Okay? So he would be more associated with a moral relativist point of view. Okay? So the question is, whose morality, so to speak, or actually to be even more accurate, whose rules shall we live by? Okay? Callicles says, in a democracy, we unfortunately live by the masses' rules. But that is unnatural. It is not desirable. Okay? And he doesn't like it. He wants to reject it. Okay? What he prefers is what he calls the strong. The strong should rule. Okay? So he comes right out and says it is not the weak who should rule, so to speak, and in their interest, but the strong should rule. Okay? And he actually claims that this is natural. Okay? Not the moral code or the set of rules that the strong come up with, but just the fact that they rule or should rule. Okay? So you can kind of think of this in terms of something maybe a little bit more familiar, the theory of evolution and the idea that survival of the fittest, and the most inclusively fit will survive. And in the animal kingdom you see behaviors of dominance, right? And the alpha male, so to speak, will he's going to determine what goes on once he wins the battle. Okay? So this is the way Callicles thinks, that democracy is a weird overturning of that based upon the masses coming up with a way to cooperate. But it's not natural. Okay? What is truly natural is for the strong to rule, and they determine the rules on this basis. Whatever harms or stops me is ugly, using Socrates' own definition. Okay? Distasteful, painful. Doing wrong if it helps me is beautiful. It's good. Okay? So it's egoistic, it's selfish. And he doesn't do this, but you might think of the children that you know in your life when they're really small. Or have you ever watched Super Nanny? Okay, I think I mentioned. Okay, Super Nanny, you got to watch this at least once, because then you will find true human nature. At least this would be, Callicles' perspective. When children are completely ungoverned, they turn into absolute monsters. Abusive, physically abusive, verbally abusive, selfish, completely disregarding of even each other's interests as well as their parents. And so when you bring order and peace to them, they somehow can transform. But you see, human nature in the raw state in some of these households where the parents are there, but they're really absent. They're not applying any sort of teaching or any sort of rule giving or discipline at all. And it is just absolutely appalling. The children's behavior. They will hit and kick and punch their parents and their siblings. That the most vile language comes out of their mouths. Okay, and I dare say that they live according to these rules. Whatever harms me is bad. According, what harms me to my definition of what harms me. Okay, now mommy may whine that I need to have vegetables in my life, but I don't like vegetables, and I only want to eat chicken nuggets. So, that chicken nugget's good, vegetables bad. I don't care what anybody else says. So that is, when you think about it, there is some support for this view that this is the natural position. Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, were some of the people with Callicles' view at the time leftover or remnants of the aristocrats that ruled Athens before it became democratic?
Some of them would have been, yeah, and there's some resonance between that. You can see that. I don't know about Callicles because we know so little about him, but you can kind of see some evidence for that, the aristocratic point of view, just in the way that he sees the masses and, his view that the strong should rule amounts to the superior as, as in more capable of directing their lives, of living their lives, of enjoying the finer things in life and so forth. So I would say maybe they might be more likely to come from that, the aristocratic class, and if not from that class, from that mentality. Okay, although Callicles is, pushes it to the extreme, so I wouldn't want to say that all of those people who still identified with an aristocracy or oligarchy would think exactly the way Callicles does. But his general opinion of the mediocrity of the masses, yeah, probably. Yeah, so that's a good observation. Yep, so yeah, to get to this very point, he disagrees with the democracy, even though in one sense they are the stronger, because the people have figured out how to band together and cooperate with each other to the extent that they control the government. Okay? Although, as the dialogue points out, the speakers may, you could argue, actually control the government, and this is a point of, contention, and it's problematic, because if the speakers control the government, that would seem to be evidence for Callicles' point of view that, really, after all, the strong do end up on top. But, he objects to this, that the people band together, but they're not really the strong, okay? Somehow they might be clever enough to be able to figure out that it's in their self-interest to control things through their cooperation. But this is a bizarre overturning of nature, okay? It is unnatural. And so he has to say, in response to Socrates' questions, that he's not really talking just about the physically strong, because if that were the case, then, we would have to admit the masses as a whole are physically stronger. That's really their power. They can take over through their numbers. Okay? But rather, not only are they maybe physically strong or not, okay, but they are worthier or more noble. Okay? And by that I don't mean morally noble. I mean Callicles expresses the idea that they are better at directing things, better at ruling things, they're better at enjoying things, they have a much greater vision, okay? Nietzsche, much later in the 19th century, said, you know, look at the masses. You know, what do they think and plan about, you know, what they're going to eat tonight for dinner, maybe whether they can afford some beer or wine, you know, are they going to make love with their wife? Do they have one? I mean, these are the kind of things that maybe they think about, but the superior person thinks about ordering everything far beyond his own immediate, you know, small life. He has an expanded vision, okay? And he wants power over things, and he wants to be able to impress his own vision on the rest of the world, okay? So this is the type of person that Callicles thinks he is and that he admires. So there's this gulf between the aristocratic view, or the superior, who is worthy of the power because he knows what to do with it, and the mediocre masses whose goals are so low, you know, they just kind of want to be left alone. You know, they want to be left alone to have a job, to, you know, to get on with their family life, maybe make some money, maybe have a couch in the living room and a TV, you know. But they don't have these grand aspirations. So do you get the distinction that he's making there? So he's saying, so isn't it terribly unjust that the mediocre masses have the power in a democracy at all, you know? I mean, even if he would concede that the rhetoricians manipulate them, still the rhetoricians have to pay attention to them. They have to figure out what people want to hear. They have to cater to them, try to give them something that they want. But, you know, should a superior person really have to do that? So, on page 61, or near number 492, we have Callicles saying, how can a man be happy if he's a slave to anything? No, my friend, what is beautiful and just, by nature, I shall now explain to you without reserve. A man who is going to live a full life must allow his desires to become as mighty as may be and never repress them. When his passions have come to full maturity, he must be able to serve them through his courage and intelligence and gratify every fleeting desire as it comes into his heart. This, I fancy, is impossible for the mob. Okay? The mob, the majority, they can't do that. And what little desires they have are fairly easily satisfied. But the superior man is somebody who has great desires and is in constant pursuit of them. And that's that life of the constant pursuit of what you desire. That is happiness for Callicles. Okay? All right, so far, do we have Callicles? Okay. And if you have ever read Nietzsche, for instance, The Genealogy of Morals, you'll find that actually there are no new ideas under the sun, because Callicles expresses the core of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals right in this dialogue. So then there's this question, how is it that those who should be happy weren't strong enough to stay in power? In other words, so how do we explain the fact that these supposedly superior people ever let it get away from them, the political power, and allowed a democracy to have it? As you referenced, you know, how did we turn from the aristocratic or oligarchic government to a democracy? How did these people not see this coming? Right? Well, you know, actually one good answer would be just the sheer numbers of people just over the, you know, this is how it actually happened. People would band together and overturn their government. That's how the revolution occurred. But Callicles has a deeper theory than that and a better explanation.
I guess I'm kind of coming to the conclusion that you have this debate about how you live your life, but it's more about what really is power. Is it power to make other people do things, or is it really the internal power that each person has, and that's how they respond to people? Because you can't really help what other people do to you. You can only help with how you respond to it.
Yeah, that's a great interpretation. Yes, you have to have power over yourself. Socrates' view is that most people don't. That most people actually are led along by inappropriate desires, or they're led along by the opinions of other people. They feel like they have to do things because of external circumstances, and so they have all these excuses, about why they're doing what they're doing. So they're not in charge of their lives. So the first power that you have to be happy, in his view, is to have that control over your own life, which would lead to, freedom to respond how you want to not feel like you're forced to respond to any particular circumstance because of some external thing, like other people's opinions or just, what you think of as absolutely necessary, like money or, security or whatever. Socrates would say almost everybody is unfree in this sense. They haven't achieved that level of self-control. Okay, so yes, that's where he's headed with Callicles, because Callicles thinks the superior person is so in control and so powerful because he can pursue his desires endlessly. But Socrates sees him on a treadmill, like a mouse, on a treadmill, or like that shrimp that was on the treadmill, or the gerbil, in the wheel. He never gets anywhere. He's always wanting more and more and more. So let's see, though, Callicles' theory here, because it's really, he goes beyond just saying, well, the people overwhelm the few with their numbers, to explaining why the few couldn't get it back. Could figure out how to get the power back. Let's see what you think of this. Let's see. I've got a different... Yeah, okay, I got a different book here than I usually do, but I found it. It's on page 51, about an inch and a half under 483. Here's Callicles, who goes on. This is a really important passage. You should read over the whole thing because it expresses his theory really well. But he says, I can quite imagine that the manufacturers of laws and conventions are the weak, the majority in fact. It is for themselves and their own advantage that they made their laws and distribute their praises and their censures. It is to frighten men who are stronger than they and are able to enforce superiority that they keep declaring to prevent aggrandizement that it is ugly and unjust, that injustice consists in seeking to get the better of one's neighbors. They're quite content, I suppose, to be on equal terms with others since they themselves are inferior. So they claim equality, 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 because you bring down the few to your level so everybody is on the same terms when they shouldn't be. So right here he's saying there's a lot of propaganda that occurs. Okay, once the people seize power, they extol democracy, they extol equality, they make it embarrassing to disagree with their point of view, and they keep this drumbeat going until it becomes frightening. Now, isn't that interesting? They frighten their superiors. Okay, still kind of begs the question, how could you so easily frighten them? Or couldn't they hold their own position a little bit better? Now, on the next page, he extends this, he deepens it by talking about the way that the children are raised in such a society. So he says on the top of page 52, it hardly coincides with the one we frame when we mold the natures of the best and strongest among us, raising them from infancy by the incantations of a charmed voice, as men do lion cubs. We enslave them by repeating again and again that equality is morality, and only this is beautiful and just. Yet I fancy that if a man appears of capacity sufficient to shake off and break through and escape from all these conventions, he will trample underfoot our ordinances and charms and spells and all this mass of unnatural legislation, and our slave will stand forth, revealed as our master, and the light of natural justice will shine forth. So there he's saying that, people, the superior people, are surrounded from the point of infancy on. Okay? And who are these people? Okay? They're the servants, they're the nanny, the cook, whoever, the teacher who educates them, the tutor, they get raised by the masses, so to speak. Okay? So from a very early age, they're told, no, Johnny, don't do that. You've got to be nice. No, it doesn't matter if this person is inferior to you in some way. Okay? You still need to be nice. It's unattractive to be mean. Okay? And so they stand less of a chance. You know, he makes this analogy like we train lion cubs. Now, if a lion is just out in nature growing up, he's going to turn into a nasty, massive killer of antelopes or whatever happens to be out there, right? And nothing's going to stand in his way. But if we raise them from a cub on, sometimes they still go kind of crazy, but they'll for the most part they won't harm human beings. They'll do tricks, right? And be nice. So raising in early childhood matters a great deal. Plato knew that, and Callicles knows that. So he's saying it's reinforced by the way these people are taught as children. And by the time they get to adulthood, they don't even know anymore, what they should do. Just because they happen to be smarter or have more ambition, those are channeled into appropriate channels. And they don't think outside of the box anymore. They don't think about what else they could do. Okay? So, I don't know if that's a good enough argument or not, but that's the extent to which he goes. And I say the democratic idea because these are the kind of things that would be taught to them, that equality and brotherhood are good, that you need to care about the common good and not just your own selfish good, and that the height of virtue is self-sacrifice for your community. Okay? Such as being a soldier and risking your life for the safety of your community, or deciding that you will work as a teacher rather than as an executive because you care about children. So democratic societies admire people who give away their own self-interest for the sake of others. And this is the untruth, as Callicles sees it, the propaganda. So from his perspective, the people who are well equipped with the ability to take advantage of whatever is in front of them should shunt aside these so-called obligations and take full advantage. Okay? Not as rhetoricians, although I don't think he would totally not admire them, but obviously if rhetoricians have to cater to the people's wishes at all, that's not exactly the position that the superior person wants to be in. Okay? So, yeah. So this is a question to ask. It isn't really answered fully in the dialogue, but it's an important question because the dialogue is about rhetoric and rhetoricians. What would Callicles say? Would he say that democracy is sort of a power vacuum to be taken advantage of by rhetoricians? Would he say that democracy is never useful under any circumstances and should just be overturned? Does the superior need to wake up and reestablish their authority? Okay. But obviously, he's got a very different point of view than Socrates, and also, I'm sure, from a lot of other people who would be. This is the type of thought that scared the bejeepers out of the more traditionalists in the society. Okay, really thought people like Callicles are coming to get us. They don't have any sort of scruples. All right. So at the end of this rather lengthy exposition of his point of view, he then turns to Socrates and examines Socrates in light of this. Is Socrates the superior man? Is he a wimp? Is he part of the mediocre masses? Well, Callicles kind of lumps him into the latter. Okay. He is not a superior man because he's defending the wrong ideas. So Callicles says you have the truth of the matter. You will become convinced of it if you only let philosophy alone. Leave philosophy alone. You know, you're occupied with the wrong thing. Okay? You need to pass on to more important considerations. Of course, Socrates' philosophy does have a certain charm if one engages in it in one's youth and in moderation. So it's good for children. But if one dallies over long, it's the ruin of a fellow. Sorry, philosophy majors. If a man, however well endowed, goes on philosophizing throughout his life, he will never come to taste the experiences which a man must have if he's going to be a gentleman and have the world look up to him. You know perfectly well that philosophers know nothing about state laws and regulations. They're equally ignorant of the conversational standards that we must have to adopt in dealing with our fellow men at home and abroad. Why, they're inexperienced even in human pleasures and desires. Think about that. So, you know, I'm not exaggerating when I say that he thinks that he's unmanly. In a word, he says they are totally innocent of all human character. So when they come to take part in a private or public affair, they make themselves ridiculous. Just as ridiculous, I dare say, as men of affairs may be when they get involved in your quibbles and your debates. So here he's saying, look, the reason why I haven't done as well in certain areas where you corner me with your arguments is because I am a man of affairs. I am involved with the affairs of state and with the society. And I don't have time to learn these little games. Okay? And what I do is more important than what you do. And, you know, and look at what you can't do. You can't affect any sort of change because you have refused as a philosopher to get involved in politics, to get involved in the world. All you want to do is argue with people. And that doesn't make things happen. All right, so this is another area where Klosko is writing about the way that Plato may be showing the ineffectuality of philosophy, okay, of just arguing with people, okay, I should say, about philosophy. And he goes on to say, I just have to complete this because it's just really quite astounding. He says, when I see a child who ought to be talking that way, lisping and prattling, I'm pleased. It strikes me as a sign of good breeding and suitable to his age. But when I hear a little lad speaking distinctly, it seems to me disagreeable and offends my ears as a mark of servile origin. So too, when I hear a grown man prattling and lisping, it seems ridiculous and unmanly. One would like to strike him hard. So, you know, it's funny, and yet it's also so true about Callicles' position. I mean, what would be a better way of dealing with Socrates if you view life the way Callicles does than just punching him? Because, you know, if you don't want to listen to him anymore, that's certainly one way to stop him. And it brings up the old might versus right issue, you know. Now, Callicles is asserting might simply by saying, look, Socrates, I'm not even interested in your quibbles. I'm going to think the way I think, okay? And I'm going to go out into the world and I'm going to make things happen. And, you know, that's more important than your reasoning. So Callicles would say might makes right. You know, in other words, first you have to be strong. Then you have influence. Then you make the rules that other people live by. Okay? Whereas obviously Socrates is thinking right makes might, or at least it should. That first you have to know what right is, and then you hopefully can influence society, or you can make the rules. But so it's funny, but it says a lot too. And it's interesting that the unmanly charge is raised here, you know, because to be a man in Greek society was a very important distinctive thing, right? I mean, manliness was either military service or political or business success. And it mattered a great deal to men, you know. how they were viewed, and to be called something like this, to be called unmasculine, would be and what it was a great insult. Okay, and yes, they had a very different lifestyle than we have, and all of that. But manliness was a big deal. So I've already quoted this, but I want to put this up here for a second because these are the kind of things that would have given a man that manly exterior. Okay? So to be successful in the business, influential in the community, which usually went hand in hand, because if you had a lot of money, you could afford to, give to the community. You could put on festivals and contests, and you could make people happy, and you could have influence through your money. Directly in politics, also athletic competition. I forgot to mention that before. So being involved in and successful in athletic competitions, all right? To be in the military and to have a record of prowess in your military pursuit. So, Socrates doesn't fit any of this. Now, he was a soldier for a brief period of time when he was young. He was a hoplite, which was the, the foot soldier. Okay, so he did serve in the military, so to speak, but he didn't distinguish himself, and he wasn't particularly interested. And there are apocryphal stories anyway of his fellow soldiers getting kind of irritated with Socrates because Socrates would take off his shoes basically and sit under a tree and start thinking while they were trying to march or they were trying to get something done. So he wasn't really into the line of work. He certainly wasn't successful financially. Really kind of got helped along by some of his wealthier friends. So he didn't fit this at all. And, I think Callicles has a little bit of a point worth at least thinking about, that philosophy may have been harmful to somebody like Socrates. In other words, Callicles is saying if you continue to philosophize as an adult, meaning if you continue to think that talking to other people about justice, and if you think expansively about this, there are a lot of people out there like that, for one, thinking more about justice than worldly pursuits, okay? Then you're harming yourself. You're like your own worst enemy. You're impeding yourself from the only success that's really possible in this world. Okay? So Socrates will never be rich. He will never be politically powerful. And most important of all, he is potentially vulnerable to being taken out by his enemies because he's not willing to spend any time becoming prominent so he can defend himself. And actually he was taken out by his enemies. So, and Plato has this in mind as he's writing this, and he's questioning, what value is philosophy? Obviously he ended up thinking it's valuable, but it's you have to contemplate this. At what point should you stop? Is it when your life may be in danger? Yes, it does leave you more vulnerable to be this type of person. And Callicles would say, you didn't do a good job defending yourself. And the world, let's say that Socrates is a valuable human being. Was the world better off or worse off when he was dead? Well, Callicles would probably answer that a different way than I would, but dead is dead. And I think that realists, really put the emphasis on that. Survival is important. For them, if the afterworld exists, it's not of nearly as much importance. And some of them don't believe in it. Okay? So, but the emphasis is on this world, and if the emphasis is on this world, then you don't do anything that could lead to your demise. And this is what Socrates did. So it's a real deep questioning of Socrates' preferred way of life and the usefulness of it, the effectiveness of it, the worth of it. Okay, and it's really devastating in a way. And it forces people to basically choose which way they're going to go. It's one way of looking at life or the other, really, that is presented in this dialogue. But certainly we know, and I'll leave it on this one, we know this, that the world doesn't reward inflexibly good people. Not inflexibly good. When we get to Machiavelli, we'll see him say, well, you can be good part of the time, but not when it doesn't serve your purposes. Then you have to be able to reverse yourself to be something else, But if a person refuses to change or to adapt or to modify according to the circumstances, they will end up in trouble at some point. And, Callicles would point this out and say, look, you do have to adapt. You have to conform to the way things really are. That's his point of view. Okay, so I will leave it at that.